Hello, everybody. I talk to you from this small screen, staring across a wide screen, um, getting ready to talk to you about globalization and particular key ideas with it, as part of just setting up the module that you're starting. That's going to be focusing particularly on globalization as something new, something old, the temporality of globalization, and where does that all fit. What I want to do right now is just introduce you to some key ideas from this dude, Ajahn Appadurai. And so that's my main kind of focus right now, because his ideas are through the two different readings that we've got this week. And I think you're going to see enormously influential sets of ideas around it. Globalization, same, different. That's where Appadurai is mainly focused. But what we're going to be focused on mainly here in this week's work, in this module 1, is the old new. Is there something really new about a globalization, or might we hold more to the view that globalization is all part of a long process? And while there are some new things happening now, it always has been. I'd be interested to see where you fit your way around it. You've got two readings. I'll talk about those a little bit more in a moment. So if we think about some of the definitions and issues around globalization, there's something captured in this. You know, do we spell it with an S or with a Z? Do you spell it with an S or with a Z? And why? What's influencing that? If you're aware to these things, you'll realise that the Z spelling, the spelling any of these kind of words with a Z, is the American way, the standard American English way. Whereas with an S, well, as they're suggesting here, it's Australian British English usage. I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure that Australian English is dominated by the S words so much as by the Z words. But of course, this is what I'm trying to get at here, is there can be a sense of we're using the S as a form of resistance to these notions of globalization, of Americanization, should I say. And as you can see, I've done my own little bit of resistance by insisting on an S rather than a Z form of globalization on a book that I happen to have my name on the front of. Is it resistance, or is it me just being old-fashioned and referring back to the old country in some way or another? Truth be known, it's probably a mix of both. But of course, in some ways, it's its own very small choice, and very much, of course, a storm in a teacup. Radio National treasure, I think, for us. It contributes enormously to the intellectual life of this country. It certainly contributes enormously to my intellectual life. The breakfast current affairs program is called AM, and I was in there recently picking off a particular episode of well, it was the one on the day, in fact, that I was in there, of AM, and I was just struck on the website as I looked at all these different headings, just how much it's focused on the themes, on so many of the things that we will pick up in this unit. What I've set for you this week is an exercise that will get you pick up the readings and get you doing some analytical work around one of the 2 to 3 minute, 4 minute segments of this particular program on, I'm just looking for the date now. I'm not going to find it straight away. I'll let that come through. Oh, sorry, Friday, 10th of July, a couple of weeks back now. Let's see where that gets us to. All right, two readings. Miller Griffith and Marion in a book that's produced by the American Anthropological Association. And theirs is a chapter that they were commissioned to write in this particular text, which is an open online text that's introducing cultural anthropology in general. So here's the chapter on globalization, written by Miller Griffith here, showing herself in the field, and the cover of the book written recently by Jonathan Marion on ballroom dancing, just to give some flavor of some of the different kinds of research that are being done in the name of anthropology. Leckler, in a particular paper that is the paper that we're going to spend probably the most time on this week, what makes globalization really new, is the question being asked there, and presenting sociological views on that in their particular paper. I'm going to stop competing with the good professor here. it's an interesting text. Part of what I want to do with setting this text is also suggesting, giving you the options perhaps of reading this in slightly different ways. So I'm suggesting a different way of looking at the text, starting with the opening, but going to the conclusion, and then reading for meaning, looking at the kinds of themes that come out with it, trying to perhaps get more effective in reading of sociological, anthropological texts, social science texts that may need some work there. So basically it's about trying to do this in a more thoughtful kind of way, and not just starting at the beginning and getting to the end and wondering what the hell that was about. Reading for meaning, trying to find what are the arguments here. So I'm just trying to prompt you to think along those lines. Have a go, see how it goes, and I'm very, very open to feedback on it. And you'll see that the suggestions are in this particular module about how to go about it. And we're going to be asking this question and asking you to have a think about, well, where do you sit in relation to this? But the most important thing to do in reading any academic text in units like this, in any of your academic work here, is to get to a sense, not of what you think about the paper, what is the person, or who are the authors that you're reading, what do they think? And then you can do the next part of that, which is, so what do I reckon? What do I make of that? But it's very important to get underneath the argument and try to understand it. And that's part of the invitation of this week. So here's the, in the books, The Laws of Globalization. I could go out. We've got Documenting Globalization. They make the point via Gemert and Altman that in the early 1990s, the US Library of Congress catalog listed less than 50 publications per year related to globalization, but from 2002 to 2014, there were more than 1,000 every year. Their argument, it's new. And the fact that there's many more articles picking up on the notion of globalization shows this. Now, there's all sorts of arguments we're going to have about that, but let's just focus in on that. Let's get that sense of it, and you'll see that this particular bibliometrical study is picked up in the readings that you're doing this week. Here are some of the keywords picked up by other researchers in this area by looking at definitions of globalization. So when you look at that, what keywords jump out at us? World obviously does. It's a process. That's an interesting insight. So it's not a thing, it's a process. National, new, process, social, cultural, economic, of course, these different things competing with each other in some instances, often not complementing each other. But look, there's just some of the thread, some of the sense of the different ways that people are viewing globalization, the essences of it, I guess. Gilbert and Altman make the point that the most cited reference in the general academic literature is Ajahn Apajara's 1996 book, Modernity at Large. So that's what the bibliometrics show, measuring the references to the different texts looking at globalization. Very, very impactful set of ideas that we're talking about. And the key metaphor is flow. So Apajara frames globalization as a flow of ideas, information, images, people, money, and technology, and captures them in a particular form, as I'm about to show. But I just thought I should show you this graphic so it can, because it is pretty spectacular use of this flow metaphor to get a sense of what's going on in the world and how these flows impact on the world that we're living in. So here's something that's picking up the speed and direction of goods moving across the world. And we're getting a bit of a sideways view to what we're perhaps used to doing. What happens if we look from a northern point of view? We start to tilt the earth in that particular way. We can certainly see concentrations, forces going on around it, and certainly quite a northern centric aspect to the flows. If we look at it with Africa very much in the center, how does that flow look? Yeah, well, it looks pretty northern, doesn't it? When you look at it from there, when we bring Australia into play, looking quite western from there. That's kind of understandable when you look at the lack of landmass in this particular part of the hemisphere. Look at that flow, very, very northern, and as I'm suggesting, very, very western as well, excuse me. Returning to the flow, so to speak. So you got that idea, and what you get then is an elementary framework that gets developed by, excuse me, as I move around your screen, elementary framework where Pagerai picks up this notion of escape. Now, clearly, not escape, escape. Taken off a suffix lifted away from landscape and then connecting it to other words, trying to get that notion of perspective here, how we see the world through how we see a world, say, in the form of a landscape, depends very much upon the person looking at it, doesn't it? If I'm producing it, they're going to have a certain personal elements. We're going to see it in our own particular way, even though objectively things are all the same. How we might interpret it might be also a little bit different. Anyway, that's the point he's making, escape. It's not objectively given, it's perspectival constructs. It's about imagined worlds, pointing to fluid irregularity of globalized formations, because that's the other thing we know about scapes, is they're never static. They are in motion, even though, of course, on the day-to-day basis, it may not quite come across in that way. And that's where the metaphor starts to stretch a bit when it gets put into the globalized world. So he refers to the movement of people as in terms of ethnoscapes, so the landscape of persons in motion. And as you'll start to see, there are suggestions of that being different in the last 20, 30, 40 years. And that makes the difference to the landscape of how and the shaping of people in motion. The ways in which we see people in these particular circumstances in the era in which we're living. Mediascapes, distribution of electronic capabilities, producing, disseminating information, the images of the world created. So that they're picking up the very, very significant importance of media in the shaping of the world, in our understanding of it. And of course, this distribution is rapid, and this is related to the technoscape. The technology is moving at high speeds across various kinds of previously impervious boundaries. I'm not so sure about the impervious bit. They might have been semi-permeable, might be a better way to describe them. The technologies have always moved. And there again, we're back into some of the ways in which people will say, well, yes, people see it as being different, but it's not, it's a difference of degree rather than kind. And back then it looked pretty fast as well. Financescapes, movement of money, and then the movement of ideas, the diaspora of ideas, the idioscape. So the notions of freedom and rights and sovereignty, but the master phrase that Pagerai suggests is there is democracy. The ideas about democracy have been moving around the globe, almost the urge, the push, the forcing into democracy, which of course many would link to the West, and particularly the Northwest of the nation, as we look at it in a very flat way, at least. Give you some sense of ways in which I've used the particular idea or the metaphor of the scape. I've attached it to the notion of education and the eduscape in trying to understand some of the changes in structures and interactions between parents and school systems in Western Australia. So practicing autonomy in our local eduscape is what I've picked up there. And here's just to give you some flavour of the ideas. And I think this just helps capture some of the ways in which the notion of the scapes can get picked up. Because the point that Pagerai is really making is that the global has to always adapt, fit into local scenes. So, and those local scenes with their own particular socio-historical realities will reshape the global. It won't be the same. The interpretations will not be the same in each of these different places. They can't be. So that's one of the very clear points he's making here. So the earlier reference to global flows signifying connections to Pagerai's ideas. Locality itself is a historical product, quoting from the man. And the histories through which localities emerge are eventually subject to the dynamics of the global. We can't escape that. Nor can the global escape the local. That's part of what he's also saying. So the flow metaphor is capturing a dynamic movement, continual rather than eventual. So it doesn't just stop anywhere. It's not just an event. It's always in motion. And in motion are ideas, ideals, values, and practices, capital, material, goods, and people in all sorts of regular and irregular ways. And of course, what I'm trying to focus on here is around education systems in the West Australian landscape, the eduscape, as I'm calling it. One of the focus here is on the structures of schooling. It's also generally the case that the ideas are it's important to bear in mind generally this is the case, and it's going to be the same in the application into the education systems as well, that they're going to lose their internal coherence when being adapted into these systems. They come out differently. So Ajahn Apajari is a paper, Disjuncture and Difference, that I'm pointing you to this week. I'm not requiring you to read it, but you might, if you want to pick up on his ideas a bit more in a brief form. There's a paper you could have a look at, Disjuncture, Separation or Disconnection. And this just helps expand some of his, or not expand, but concentrate some of the ideas he has around globalization and the movement of people, ideas, technology, media and finance across the globe. So you could pick up on that. But here are some key points. He emphasizes homogenization versus, well, if we think about homogenization versus heterogenization, I think it is the case that he believes that the homogenizing forces are much stronger than the heterogenizing forces, but nevertheless, he is certainly arguing that the two are held in dynamic tension. Homogenization is often synonymous with Americanization in many people's eyes, or perhaps commoditization might be the other way of saying that. And he's certainly urging us to think about it in more nuanced ways than that. As he points out in this text, some people are much more worried about Japanesization of the world, or Sinicization, Chinese influence on the world, than they are about American impacts on what's going on. And what he's arguing there is that we can too often ignore the indigenization of the forms of practice. So the fact that they have to be adapted into local conditions. So the global ideas, the people who are moving around, they don't just come in and be the same. They get indigenized in some ways. They get adapted into the local places. There is no choice but to do that as well. An important element of what he's getting at. But he certainly is clear that he's not really talking about it in a hybridizing way. It's not an equal impact. He's certainly not arguing that. Now, those running nation states can use fears of homogenization for their own ends, their own hegemonic strategies. Just make that note there about hegemony being the sort of dominant ideas of the ruling groups, but that come to be incorporated into the common sense of a population through formal education, through advertising, through the kinds of ideas that get in circulation in the nation state. And so those running nation states can really find ways of getting a political agenda going by instilling the fear of Americanization. I think you'll see that we'll be picking up that theme quite a bit, or it's certainly in one of the modules that's coming up, and particularly in relation to A Place Very Dear to Apajari's Heart in India. He rejects the older models, the more binary kinds of models that emphasize the power of the center and how they're forever impacting on the periphery. He would argue that there is more impact. The periphery is influencing the center as well in that regard. Again, these are theories we'll come to and get some ideas around the push-pulls ideas and so on. So he's rejecting really simple dichotomies. He's looking for much more nuance in understanding what's going on here. Very attracted to the idea from Lashanuri of disorganized capitalism. So capitalism is not as straightforward and as well organized as it often appears. The paper's there to be read if you want to get further into it. Conclusion he draws, the critical point is both sides of the coin of the global cultural processes, the global, the local, the global forces, the local forces, are products of the infinitely varied mutual contest of sameness and difference on a stage characterized by radical disjunctures, radical breakages between different sorts of global flows and the uncertain landscapes created in and through these disjunctures. Interesting ideas, things to work with, to think about, to keep seeing how you can incorporate them into your thinking and the ways in which you're coming to grips with some of the ideas going on here. Apajari has some interesting ideas about agency, the producers as the real agent, not the consumer. And I'm just raising this because I want to talk a little bit in a separate piece about structure and agency. And he makes the point about it's a mistake to think of the consumer as an agent. Really, they are at best a chooser. I would actually turn around and argue, well, that actually, as I believe, what agency is actually about. But let me come to that in another kind of argument. Let's just get to a summary. Globalization, slippery, complex concept in the social sciences. Folks, just about every concept in the social sciences is slippery and complex, contested, um, and not undefinable, but there will be a variety of definitions. Come to expect this, and part of the challenge for yourselves is to work out which sort of definition is going to work best for you. You're going to be encountering anthropological, sociological readings of the concept in the main. I mean, we will draw upon others, and people who are writing in anthropology and sociology also draw on political science and education theory and cultural studies and the likes. So it's not just one-way traffic, but that's our main focus. And part of what you need to be seeing yourself as doing here is getting disciplined into the thinking of anthropology and sociology, introduced to it to see how that perspective can help you see the world or not, as you may come to see it. But what are the advantages it brings? What are some of the limitations? Weighing up some of that. Apagera, that notion of globalization as flow, that's the dominant metaphor in the globalization literature, I would suggest. The global has come to how the global gets embedded into local scenes, adapting to local geo-historical realities. And he certainly writes about it in forms of mutuality, but he doesn't see it as equal mutuality. The five scapes, do you find them useful metaphors? Do they offer analytical power? Well, hopefully there's a couple of exercises you can do in the next little while that'll help test some of that out. Giving you a sense of, well, what does this allow us to do? And how does it get us beyond giving a fancy word for the movement of people when we start to refer to them as ethnoscapes? You might need to do, you never know, a little bit more reading around it. See how you go. Good luck with it. As always, if you've got any questions, make sure you get in touch with me. All right. Good luck.